In the spring of 1911, a surveyor named Thomas Reddick waded into a stretch of black water in the interior of a swamp the maps of the time called Kestrel Hollow, and he did not come out again for 3 days. When he did, his boots were gone, his notebook was swollen shut with water, and he carried with him a single object that would sit in a filing drawer for the next 40 years without anyone quite knowing what to do with it. It was a disc of hammered copper, roughly the size of a dinner plate, etched with a spiral that did not match anything in the regional pottery record. Reddick had been sent to the hollow by the Continental Antiquities Bureau to confirm a rumor, nothing more. Trappers had been coming out of the swamp for a decade telling stories about a sunken platform somewhere past the sawgrass line, a structure built by hands that were not supposed to have been there. Reddick's job was to find the platform, sketch it, and file a report that would either confirm the rumor or put it to rest. He filed a report. It did neither. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What he described instead was a wooden platform submerged under 6 feet of tannin-black water, built from cypress logs notched and pegged in a pattern he had never seen in any regional structure, extending at least 60 feet in each direction and covered along its edges with copper sheeting that had been worked, not simply hammered flat, but shaped into the same spiral pattern as the disc he brought back. Reddick's field notes, recovered later from the swollen notebook, described 3 days of wading, backtracking, and losing the platform in the cypress shadow before he found it again on the final afternoon, at the exact moment his supplies ran low enough that he had already decided to turn back. He wrote that the water near the platform was noticeably colder than the surrounding hollow, though he offered no explanation and did not repeat the observation in his official report. He also wrote, in a passage his supervisor apparently found unnecessary and cut from the filed version, that he had counted 11 distinct copper panels along the platform's visible edge before the light failed and he lost his footing on the drop-off into deeper water. The cut passage survives only because a clerk transcribing the report by hand copied it before anyone told her not to. The report went into the Bureau's files under a case number. The platform was never revisited. Reddick was reassigned to a survey in another state within the year, and the swamp closed back over whatever he had found, the way swamps do. The people who lived along the edges of Kestrel Hollow before Reddick ever arrived called themselves the Owatee, a name that in their own language meant something closer to those who keep the water's memory than a simple tribal designation. By the time the Bureau took an interest in the region, the Owatee numbered fewer than 200, scattered across a handful of settlements at the swamp's dry margins, and the written record of them consisted mostly of traders' ledgers and a handful of missionary letters that treated their presence as an obstacle to land survey rather than a subject worth understanding on its own terms. The Owatee built their homes on raised timber platforms of their own, a construction technique suited to a landscape that flooded twice a year with predictable violence, and they moved through the swamp by canoe along channels that outsiders rarely learned well enough to navigate alone. Every Owatee child, according to the fragmentary record that survives, was taught the deep hollow as a place to avoid, not out of superstition exactly, but out of the same practical caution a coastal family might teach about a riptide. The water there ran differently. The current pulled toward the center rather than away from it, and more than one Owatee hunter over the generations was remembered by name for having gone in after a drifting canoe and not come back the same afternoon. What the missionary letters preserved, almost by accident, was a set of stories the Owatee told about that deep hollow where the water ran black even in daylight and the cypress grew close enough to blot out the sky. The stories described a platform built long before the Owatee's own grandparents were born, raised by a people who arrived from somewhere across open water, who worked copper the way the Owatee worked reeds, who stayed for a generation, and who left the same way they came, without explanation, taking most of what they had built with them and leaving only the parts too heavy to carry. The Owatee did not treat this as legend in the way a modern reader might expect. They treated it as history, the same category of knowledge as a flood year or a hard winter, passed down because it was true and useful, not because it was entertaining. The story was told, according to Marsh's later interviews, at a specific time of year, after the first cold snap, when the families gathered indoors and the children were considered old enough to hear about the parts of the swamp they were not yet allowed to visit alone. A missionary named Cornelius Vane recorded fragments of this account in 1862 in a private letter to his brother rather than in any official church correspondence, which is likely the only reason it survived at all. Vane wrote that an Owatee elder named Isu had taken him to the edge of the deep hollow and pointed out across the water toward a place Vane could not see clearly through the cypress, and told him that beneath that water was a floor no living person had walked on in longer than anyone could count. Vane's letter treated the claim with the polite skepticism common to educated men of his era. He noted the elder's certainty without sharing it, and moved on in the same paragraph to a complaint about mosquitoes. It is a small detail, but it matters. Vane had no reason to invent the story. He was not trying to prove anything. He simply wrote down what he saw and heard, the way people do when they do not yet understand that what they are recording will matter to someone else, decades later, trying to reconstruct a picture from fragments. Vane's letter closes with a line his brother apparently found worth preserving on its own, since it was later copied into a family Bible as a kind of keepsake. Vane wrote that Isu had not seemed to be telling a story so much as reporting a fact he found mildly regrettable that the younger missionary did not already know. The copper disc that Reddick carried out of the swamp sat in the Bureau's regional office until 1953, when a young metallurgist named Grace Okafor, working through a backlog of uncatalogued field artifacts, ran a composition test on it out of what she later described as simple curiosity. The disc was pure copper, unalloyed, worked cold rather than cast, and etched with a technique that used a resist compound rather than a direct engraving tool, a method that appears in the archaeological record of exactly one other regional tradition, more than 400 miles to the north, associated with a mound-building culture that had, by every accepted timeline, no documented presence in the swamp at all. Okafor ran the test twice before she trusted the result, and a third time on a small shaving taken from the disc's underside, where the etching would not be visibly disturbed. All three tests agreed. Her memo on the finding was 2 pages long. It asked a simple question. If the working method matches a tradition 400 miles away and no local source of comparable copper exists within 100 miles of the hollow, where did the raw material come from and who carried it here? The memo was filed. No follow-up survey was ever funded. Okafor requested travel authorization to visit the hollow directly in the spring of 1954. The request was denied on budgetary grounds, the same explanation given to a similar request 2 years later from a colleague who had read Okafor's memo and wanted to pursue it. Okafor left the Bureau 18 months after her original finding for a position in private industry, and the file, like Reddick's before it, closed back over itself. In an interview conducted decades later for a small regional history newsletter, Okafor, then in her 80s, said only that she had never stopped wondering about the disc, and that she still kept a photograph of it in a drawer at home, though she had never gone back to see the original again. What the disc and Vane's letter and the trapper's stories share is a shape, not a proof. Each one points toward the same conclusion from a different direction, without any of them confirming it outright. The oral account describes visitors who worked copper and then left. The physical object is copper, worked in a style foreign to the region, using raw material that had to travel a significant distance to reach the hollow. The written record shows an institution that looked at the evidence twice, in 1911 and again in 1953, and declined both times to look closer. None of these things alone would draw much attention. Together, they describe a pattern that the accepted history of the region has never had to account for, because the accepted history never had to confront all 3 pieces sitting on the same table at the same time. The deep hollow itself sits at the center of a section of swamp that modern maps mark simply as restricted wetland, a designation that has more to do with drainage patterns and mosquito control than with any archaeological concern on paper. Access requires a permit that the Regional Wildlife Office rarely grants, citing habitat protection for a species of heron that nests in the cypress canopy above the water. Whether that restriction is coincidental or convenient depends on how much weight a person is willing to put on institutional silence. What is documented is this. In the 60 years since Reddick's report, exactly one formal survey team has requested access to the Deep Hollow in 1978, and that request was denied on habitat grounds before it reached the stage of equipment planning. The team's lead researcher, a graduate student named Daniel Marsh, wrote a short paper afterward arguing that the denial was procedurally unusual, since comparable habitat restrictions in the same wetland system had been waived twice in the preceding decade for oil and gas surveys operating far closer to the heron nesting grounds than his own proposed equipment would have come. The paper was published in a regional academic journal, with a circulation small enough that almost no one outside the immediate field ever read it. Marsh did not stop asking. He spent the better part of the next decade working outside formal institutional channels, interviewing the last surviving members of Owatee families who still lived at the swamp's margins, cross-referencing their accounts against the trapper stories that had first drawn Reddick to the hollow in 1911. He taught himself to navigate the outer channels by canoe, the way the Owatee once had, and spent long stretches of each summer camped at the swamp's dry margins rather than commuting from the university an hour away. Colleagues who knew him during those years described a man who kept his university appointment mostly intact while pouring almost everything else, money, vacation time, weekends, into a project his own department chair once described, not unkindly, as a hobby that had gotten out of hand. What Marsh assembled, never published in full and preserved mostly in a set of field notebooks that passed to his daughter after his death in 2003, was a more complete version of the story Vane had only glimpsed a fragment of. The visitors, according to the Owatee accounts Marsh recorded, had not simply worked copper at the platform. They had built it as a processing site, a place to shape raw material that arrived already extracted from somewhere else, somewhere the Owatee elders described only as the far water, a phrase Marsh could never pin down to a specific geography. The visitors stayed for what the accounts described as a generation, roughly 20 years by Marsh's estimate, and then departed as a group, in a manner the oral record treated as sudden rather than gradual. They did not abandon the site slowly. They left it in what one of Marsh's informants, an elder named Coosa Whitehorn, described through her grandson as a single season, taking the finished work with them and leaving the platform itself, too heavy and too fixed to move. Marsh's notebooks describe Whitehorn as reluctant at first, willing to confirm the broad shape of the story, but hesitant to add detail beyond what her grandmother had told her directly. It took 3 visits over 2 summers before she agreed to let Marsh record her account on tape, rather than simply repeat it from memory while he wrote. Marsh's own notes speculate that the hesitation had less to do with secrecy than with a kind of care, a reluctance to let a story that had survived this long be flattened into a single fixed version on a cassette. Whitehorn's account, recorded by Marsh in 1984 and preserved in his notebooks, included one detail that Marsh flagged in the margin with 3 underlines, the closest his careful academic prose ever came to visible excitement. The visitors, she said, had left because word came to them that the far water was no longer safe to cross, that something had happened at the place they came from that made the journey too dangerous to continue. She did not know what that something was. Neither did her grandmother, who had told her the story. The knowledge of the cause had been lost even within the oral tradition itself, leaving only the shape of the departure, sudden and complete, without the reason behind it. Marsh interviewed 2 other Owatee descendants that same year, a brother and sister living 40 miles apart who had not spoken to each other in a decade, and both, independently, described the same detail about a sudden departure tied to news from across the water. Neither knew the other had said it, and Marsh only discovered the overlap when he transcribed both interviews in the same week and noticed the phrasing was almost identical. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marsh died before he could return to the hollow with equipment capable of confirming any of it, and his notebooks sat in a storage unit for 11 years before his daughter, sorting through her father's effects, contacted a small independent archaeological survey group in 2014 and offered them the material. That group, working without Bureau funding or Bureau permission, conducted a limited sonar survey of the deep hollow's accessible margins in the fall of that year, staying carefully within the boundary of the habitat restriction rather than risk the legal exposure of crossing it. What the sonar returned was a submerged structure consistent with Reddick's original description, roughly 60 feet across, with a return signature along its edges that the survey's lead technician, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, described in her report as metallic and regular, consistent with worked sheet copper rather than natural mineral deposit. Chandrasekaran noted in a follow-up interview that the structure's outline was too geometrically consistent to be a natural log jam, the kind of debris accumulation the Wildlife Office had suggested as an alternative explanation when her group first requested comment. A logjam does not hold a 60-foot perimeter with the regularity her equipment recorded. Something had been built, and built with intention. The survey group requested a follow-up permit to send a diver into the restricted zone for direct visual confirmation. That request has been pending with the Regional Wildlife Office for 6 years, without denial and without approval, sitting in the particular kind of bureaucratic silence that neither confirms nor closes a question. Chandrasekaran has written twice asking for a status update. Both replies, nearly identical in wording, stated that the request remained under review pending completion of an unrelated habitat assessment with no announced timeline. She has not received a third reply, and the last time she spoke publicly about the case, at a small regional conference in 2022, she said only that she still checked her mail for a decision every few months, more out of habit at this point than expectation. Chandrasekaran's team did not stop at the sonar. In the winter of 2015, with the water level in the outer channels lower than usual after a dry season, 2 members of the group walked the accessible margin of the hollow on foot, staying outside the restricted boundary, but close enough to photograph a stretch of shoreline that Reddick's original report had marked with a small hand-drawn symbol nobody in the modern group could interpret. What they found there was a scatter of worked stone, chert flakes, and 2 grinding tools, consistent with a temporary camp rather than a permanent settlement. Carbon dating on organic residue recovered from one of the grinding tools returned a range that placed the site's use somewhere in the same general era the Owatee oral tradition assigned to the visitors, though the sample was small enough that the survey group listed the result as suggestive rather than conclusive in their internal notes. It was, even so, the first piece of physical evidence outside the platform itself and the copper disc to align with the story Marsh had spent a decade assembling from testimony alone. A regional historian named Walter Aldous, who had corresponded with Marsh in the 1990s and later reviewed Chandrasekaran's findings at her request, raised a question in an unpublished letter that the survey group still circulates among itself, passed from one new member to the next, as something closer to an open assignment than a settled footnote. Aldous pointed out that the Owatee word Marsh had translated as, "the far water did not behave," grammatically, the way ordinary geographic terms behaved in the fragments of the language that had been recorded. It carried a marker the other place names in Marsh's notebooks did not use, one that Aldous, working from a limited 19th century missionary word list, believed indicated distance measured in difficulty rather than distance measured in miles. If Aldous was right, and he was careful to say he could not be certain given how little of the original language survives in written form, the far water might not describe a specific location at all. It might describe any crossing considered dangerous enough to warrant the phrase, a category, rather than a coordinate. The distinction matters. It would mean the Owatee account was not naming a place the visitors came from, but naming the nature of the journey itself, which reopens rather than narrows the question of where that journey began. None of this settled anything, and Chandrasekaran has said as much in every interview she has given since. What it did was thicken the file. A submerged structure matching a century-old description, a copper disc worked in a foreign technique, a scatter of stone tools on the shoreline nearby, dated to roughly the right era. An oral account whose central geographic term may describe a kind of journey rather than a fixed destination. 4 separate lines of evidence, gathered by 4 sets of people who mostly never spoke to one another, converging without any of them intending to converge, on the same 60 feet of black water that Reddick stumbled into by accident in 1911, and that no one has been allowed to properly examine since. The platform is still there. The sonar confirms that much, even if no one has been permitted to touch it directly since Reddick pulled himself out of the black water in 1911 with a swollen notebook and a copper disc he could not explain. The copper disc itself sits today in a climate-controlled storage room at the Bureau's Regional Archive, catalogued, photographed, and almost never requested for viewing. Okafor's composition memo is filed 3 drawers down from it, in a folder that has not been opened, according to the archive's own sign-out log, since 2009. Vane's letter survives in a University Special Collections library, donated by his descendants in the 1950s, available to any researcher who requests it, read by almost none. Marsh's field notebooks are now held by his daughter, who has offered digital copies to any accredited researcher who asks, and who says fewer than a dozen people have taken her up on it in the years since her father's death. There is one more piece to the file, added more recently than any of the others, and it came from a source none of the previous researchers had thought to consult. In 2019, a genealogist working on an unrelated family history project came across a diary kept by a trapper's wife named Effie Coulter, who had lived at the swamp's edge in the 1890s, roughly 2 decades before Reddick's survey. Coulter's diary was never intended for anyone outside her own family, and it recorded the ordinary business of a trapping household: weather, debts, illness, the price of pelts. Buried in an entry from the autumn of 1894, between a note about a sick mule and a complaint about a neighbor's fence line, Coulter wrote that her husband and another trapper had gone into the deep hollow chasing a wounded deer, and had come back describing a floor under the water that neither man could explain, boards laid in a pattern too regular to be driftwood, and metal along the edges that caught the little light that reached that far into the cypress. Coulter's husband never went back. He told his wife, according to the diary, that some places were better left to whatever had built them, and the family let the matter drop. The Coulter diary predates Reddick's official survey by 17 years, which means the Deep Hollow's structure was known to at least one non-Owatee family well before the Bureau ever sent anyone to look for it, and that the knowledge, once again, went nowhere. No one told the Bureau, no one thought to. The genealogist who found the diary eventually connected with Chandrasekaran's group after recognizing the description in a regional newsletter that had briefly covered the 2014 Sonar survey, and the diary now sits digitized alongside Marsh's notebooks, Vane's letter, and Okafor's memo, one more independent account arriving at the same 60 feet of black water from a direction nobody had thought to check. What the Deep Hollow holds, beneath its black water and its restricted access designation, is not a settled answer. It is a set of fragments that point toward each other with more consistency than coincidence usually allows. A platform built in a style foreign to the region, a copper disc worked with a technique traceable to a tradition 400 miles distant. An oral account, preserved almost by accident across 3 generations of researchers who were not looking for each other, describing visitors who came from somewhere across open water, worked the copper, and left suddenly when word reached them that the crossing had become unsafe. A sonar signature that matches the century-old written description down to the size and shape of the structure it outlines. None of it proves what happened at the far water, or where it was, or why the departure came all at once rather than as a slow decline. The swamp has kept that part of the story for itself. Reddick's original report is still in the Bureau's files, case number intact, unrevisited for over a century, except by the handful of people who knew to go looking for it. The sonar data from 2014 sits alongside it now, 2 documents separated by 103 years, describing the same 60 feet of submerged cypress and copper, neither one enough on its own to settle the question, both of them together harder to dismiss than either would be alone. The last living Owatee elder with direct family memory of the Deep Hollow stories, a woman named Ada Fuel, gave a short interview to a local radio station in 2021, the only recorded interview she agreed to before her death the following year. She was asked, near the end of the segment, whether she believed the platform was really built by visitors from across the water, or whether she thought the story had grown taller with each generation that told it. She did not answer the question directly. She said instead that her grandmother had never once told the story the same way twice, adding a detail here, leaving one out there, the way any story told from memory changes shape over time, but that the ending had never changed. The visitors came, they worked the copper, word reached them that the crossing was no longer safe. They left in a single season and did not come back. Fuel said her grandmother had been just as certain of that ending at 90 as she had been at 40, and that certainty, more than any detail of the story itself, was the thing Fuel had chosen to trust. The herons still nest in the canopy above the water. The permit still waits in whatever drawer holds pending requests. Chandrasekharan's team has not disbanded. Two of its original members still meet once a year, informally, to review whatever scraps of new information have surfaced. A satellite image with unusual shading near the hollow's center, a new lead on a family with unrecorded Owatee testimony, a rumor from a hunting guide about equipment left half submerged near the old channel markers. None of it has amounted to a breakthrough. All of it has been enough to keep the file open in the only way that matters now, in the attention of people who have not agreed to forget about it. Fuel's grandson, who now keeps a copy of Marsh's notebooks alongside the recording of his grandmother's radio interview, says he has never been out to the hollow himself. He says he does not need to see the platform to believe the story is true, and that in a way he would rather it stay under the water a while longer, undisturbed by anyone's equipment, so that when the permit finally clears and someone does go down to look, the family that has carried the story the longest will still be the ones who get to say whether what the diver finds matches what they were always told. And somewhere under 6 feet of tannin-black water, in a hollow that the map marks as protected wetland and nothing more, a platform built by hands the historical record was never asked to account for, is still sitting exactly where it was left, waiting for someone with the right permission and the right equipment to finally go down and look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.